welcome back to the Contemplative Science podcast. I hope you're really well, wherever you are in the world listening in. My name is Jamie, and it is my pleasure to introduce my co-host, Dr. Mark Miller. Mark, how's it going?
Hey, James. Very good, thank you.
Yeah, today is particularly exciting, and it's one we've been looking forward to for the longest time. Today's guest is Doug Veenhof. Doug, as you'll soon find out, is a whole bunch of things. He's a former mountain guide and an award-winning journalist, but he's also an incredibly dedicated practitioner of meditation. And today we get an opportunity to pick his brains about his retreat center, research lab, and his wider practice. Doug, how are you?
I'm very well, thank you. Greetings from Colorado.
God, I'm jealous. Greetings from Colorado. Greetings from rainy East London. Doug, am I right at the moment in saying you're spending most of the year in retreat?
Uh, well, yes and no. So I have been in retreat at Ling here, which is the center in Crestone, Colorado, for the Center for Contemplative Research, of which there are three centers around the world. One in the mothership is in Crestone, Colorado, and then we have one under development in Castellina Maritima in Italy, which I have also spent years working on, and then another one on the South Island of New Zealand. And so at the moment, so for 2 years I have been here, and I have spent much of the year, each of those 2 years, in deep retreat. And then part of the year also I am working for the organization, both the international organization, and then also largely now with development plans here at Ling in Crestone. And so I have 30 years experience as a building contractor, also among the things that you mentioned. Wow. And so we have plans for this summer, large construction plans. And so I am the one who is directing that as well. So at the moment, what I am doing is spending about half of my time in retreat or in meditation. I spend, somewhere around 6-7 hours a day meditating now, and about half of the time in post-meditation. So it could be that many of your listeners who aren't in retreat now, my experience right now, having to be engaged with the world, might resonate with what they're doing also right now.
Yeah.
We've read you saying long retreat. And just to clarify, retreat here means being somewhere, meditating a number of hours a day without having your usual activities, often in silence. Is that a fair characterization?
I think absolutely. So retreat really connotes to me that you are leaving the world of daily affairs that you are accustomed to, and your days are focused entirely on meditation practice.
And we've read you say that long retreat is a test of the Dzogchen proposition that genuine happiness is a process of subtraction. What do you mean by genuine happiness is a process of subtraction?
Yeah, that's a pretty radical statement, isn't it?
Yeah.
Doing less
Great.
leads to greater happiness. And it is exactly the opposite of what motivates our contemporary society in modernity, of which you could say the triumvirate, the trinity of modernity is materialism, hedonism, and consumerism. And the basic proposition of the advertising world that is trying to get us to consume more, to believe in materialism, and to believe that because the mind ends when our bodies die, that you might as well live it up and enjoy yourself as much as possible. And that is the path to happiness. I think that most people just live their lives by. This is the real path to happiness for most people is following those three. And so it's not just so Dzogchen is a called the Great Perfection in Tibetan Buddhism, and so Dzogchenpas, practitioners of Dzogchen, and which is very similar to Mahamudra. They're real cousins. Um, we think of ourselves as the pinnacle of Buddhist practice, but really it's the theme throughout all of Buddhism. And I think through a great deal, most of the world's great religions, and also this was something that was really enunciated by Aristotle as well, and the Greek philosophers. And that is the concept that eudaimonia, uh, which is genuine happiness, authentic happiness, is really something very different than hedonic pleasure. And you could think of genuine happiness as something that you bring to the world rather than what the world gives to you. And so it is really looking within for the sources of happiness rather than looking without. And
It's
so oh, I'm sorry.
no, please, please.
Well, so the practice, how that relates specifically to meditation then, is that this is the basic framework that by doing less or looking within, you are going to find the true sources of happiness. And what is really radical, I think, is to not only have as a part of your worldview, but really then to experience as you devote time to meditation practice the fact that all of the attributes of genuine happiness that we seek for outside actually are natural attributes of the mind itself. The nature of the mind is by nature what we the intermediate goal that we find in shamatha meditation is non-conceptuality, luminosity, and bliss. And so the non-conceptuality is people often would think of as peace, serenity, and the kind of thing that people might find look for outside themselves by opioids, for instance, or heroin or something like that. And then the non-conceptuality, luminosity is a really intense clarity of the mind. And being a former mountain guide and backcountry skier and a number of other things like that, I know that extreme sports can really lead to that sort of clarity and intense presence in the moment. And so people would look outside themselves on that path to really what we want to experience is the non-conceptuality and that intense clarity. And then the bliss, which is what people are looking for in all manner of consumer activity and just, what is it that I can really do to generate and maintain bliss. But so the radical aspect of Dzogchen meditation practice, and I think generally most Buddhist meditation practice, and I think when you come down to it, contemplative practice, is that you strip away all of the outer activities. You're left only with examining your own mind. And when you really get into your practice, this is what you find, the non-conceptuality, luminosity, and bliss. And that then really begins to feel like the beginnings, the threshold of authentic happiness.
Yeah, wow. Wow, it's a hopeful message, isn't it? That happiness is already essential, that we don't need to go out and do anything for it. Rather, it's just a kind of stripping it away. But our current neuroscience of happiness is really going in another way, isn't it? I mean, we often see today, for instance, Rob Rutledge's lab characterizes happiness just as hedonic experiences in the brain. So just as the dopamine system doing what it does when we get rewarded. And so we have a kind of neuroscience of happiness that is fueling a little bit this idea that dopamine hits is what we mean by happiness. And this is a very different idea of happiness that you have in play. I wonder if because you, and we'll get around to talking about this today, I hope, that the retreat centers that you guys are growing are also research centers. And I'm wondering if you are building a research program around this idea of happiness. If there's another way that we can be looking at maybe the brain and the body that's not just the hedonic form of happiness, but is a more comprehensive eudaimonic approach to happiness.
Yes, so the research is a very important part of the Center for Contemplative Research. So that I think is really what makes this organization unique, as far as I know, in the world right now. We are providing ideal conditions for long-term meditators to really explore the mind and to develop the contemplative technology that is required to really examine the nature of the mind and also to discover authentic happiness, alternative approaches to authentic happiness. So it really is a very different approach than even positive psychology, where it's kind of formulaic. You have a prescribed number of positive thoughts, and then rehearse gratitude, and then you begin to feel happiness. But it's more again that stripping away. And I think I've lost the thread of your question. Oh, what are we
Oh, that's
doing?
I was just wondering if maybe some of the experiments that you're doing, some of the science that you're doing in these centers is based on this other way of thinking about happiness. So not just looking at happiness as dopamine hits, but trying to find a
Yeah,
science of maybe authentic happiness or deeper forms of happiness.
yeah. So there are two very important aspects, I think, of the research here, and what we hope to contribute to the scientific understanding of the mind and of happiness. So one, you could say almost in Buddhist terminology, they're ultimate and relative. And so
Right,
the ultimate nature uh, is really one thing that we are hoping to contribute is
right,
that by understanding the nature of the mind, we can really understand and demonstrate and in a sense prove scientifically and to change the model of the mind in science that the mind is primary and that the mind is not an epiphenomenon of neuroscience. And that so working on neural correlates and just examining neural correlates and trying to using those to try to figure out what is the nature of the mind and thinking that there is only physical phenomena in the universe is something that we think that first person scientific investigation through contemplation can really lead to answering the questions that physicists really have now, which it's very interesting, I think, in the models of science that just at the time that physics was abandoning the model that there is only physical phenomena in the world, that the life sciences and mind sciences were doubling down on this machine model, and that all of that the mind, for instance, is an epiphenomenon, just is only the product of neural activity. So if we can, and there are actual scientific experiments that we hope to be able to, uh, and demonstrations that very accomplished meditators can demonstrate the primacy of the mind. That will really uh, transform the life sciences and mind sciences to something that is a lot more coherent with the theories of modern physics right now. And
wow,
so that's one aspect. You think of that, I think of that as the ultimate nature, understanding the ultimate nature of the mind. But at the same time, what we realize is that meditation has a tremendous amount to offer to just ordinary happiness or to understanding genuine happiness. And so by we are able to do, and this was especially demonstrated in the precursor of what we're doing right now, which was the Shamatha project in the year 2007, which is still regarded as the most ambitious and most illuminating of all longitudinal experiments on meditators ever undertaken. And that was in 2007, something that was designed by Alan Wallace and Clifford Sarin from the University of California, Davis, and involving 40 scientists from around the world, and bringing together 60 meditators for 6 months, and doing longitudinal studies on them. And so what they found then was that what the attributes of authentic happiness, like self-acceptance, serenity, self-reported peace, uh, everything from, in blood measurements, EEG studies, all of that, that people did improve happiness, empathy, compassion, and there were very significant biological changes as well. So this is part of the mission that His Holiness the Dalai Lama has given us, is to work on both of these aspects, to try to understand and really fathom the nature of the mind, and to work on and to demonstrate and have veridical, verifiable third-person research that actually proves that this process of subtraction really does lead to greater happiness. And so this is really the motto of the Center for Contemplative Research, is fathom the mind, heal the world.
Yeah, so what you've just sort of outlined, I guess, is the thesis and given the scientific background for the thesis. But I have to ask about the antithesis, which is sort of the chaotic and, if we're being romantic about it, rich and colourful and full lives that people lead. And for those people who consider themselves quote unquote happy, now they might mean something slightly different to what you mean when you say happy. Do you view their form of happiness as a similar kind, a different kind?
Well, I think it can depend on what the motivation is for people's activities and behaviors. And I think that anybody who invests in hedonia as a path to happiness realizes that the second pizza isn't as satisfying as the first pizza, or the maybe the fourth hour at the pub isn't as satisfying as the third hour at the pub. There is just something about hedonic pleasure that wears out and is intrinsically unsatisfying. And I think that all of us have run experiments on this in our lives, and that when we're younger, perhaps we jump into the hedonic world with great enthusiasm, and it doesn't take too long. Really, if you experiment with that as a path to happiness, not just as a way of killing time or as a way of filling a void or something like that, but if you're really a philosopher of your life and you figure, and you investigate, is this really truly the way to feeling good sustainably? Or do I just need more of the stimulus to maintain happiness? And do I need novelty as a quality of the stimulus also? So it's not that we are anhedonic, that we are anti-pleasure by any means, because pleasure is very satisfying and important in people's lives. But I think what is very important to realize is that the pleasure that we experience is never a quality of the stimulus. It is always something that we are bringing to the experience.
And when you think about hedonism, I think about hedonism and I think the pub, as you described, or the second pizza. But what about sort of this, as I see it, less hedonic model of I'm a writer and I take regular walks in the park and I'm serious about my literature and I struggle with it, but it's meaningful. Where do you view that as compared to the second pizza or pub type model of happiness?
Well, for one, I think it depends on Um, so walking, for instance, there is something I think very something good that happens and pleasurable that happens with exercise, and that is in retreat. That is a big part of uh, my experience every day. Is I do something very active, get vigorous aerobic exercise, uh, or just go for a 5 mile walk every day. And so there are subtle body components to that as well, moving prana around, discharging stale prana. There are all sorts of reasons that a walk in the park, just being in nature, is also known to be very satisfying and to be rewarding and to be fulfilling. So those are aspects I think that when you really um, examine as a scientist and an empiricist, what is it that is leading to happiness? Reading good literature, there is something that is really really rewarding in that for me as well. I'm a huge fan of Tolstoy and have read War and Peace 6 times. Uh, but there, and it is just one of the most satisfying and beautiful things that uh, I used to do during the winter in retreats in old, remote mountain cabins. So I think that uh, those are, I don't know how you would categorize that or put a label on that as compared to physical pleasures, but those are already beginning to be more of a mental experience. And and by watching what is going on in our minds, we realize these are things to be cultivated as aspects of sustainable happiness.
Yeah, it's interesting to hear you say that because obviously there's a spectrum of activities outside the retreat context. And it's not a binary of retreat or not retreat. It's probably a spectrum of hedonism and consumerism, as you described, on one end, and contemplation on the other. And speaking of contemplation, I have to ask, and I have to quote you again. You've said, quote, I will go into my cabin, let the activities and identities that have accreted over a lifetime gradually become irrelevant. What are the mechanics of the process of your identities and activities becoming irrelevant?
Well, so the activities that you have been pursuing or I have been pursuing for periods uh, leading up to the beginning of retreat become irrelevant because you're no longer doing those.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
you have decided to that the most important thing that you can do and the most meaningful thing that you can do is to go into solitude for a time. So that's the how the activities of the past become irrelevant. But then the identities become irrelevant, partly because the roles that you have been playing, uh, the personas that you have been playing out in the your work, your family, uh, all of the activities of your life no longer require those personas, and so you are able to, for one, you are doing other practices. It could be many people in that go into long retreat aren't doing the kind of retreat that we're doing here at Center for Contemplative Research. They're doing Vajrayana practices, where the whole identity is to take on a new identity of a being that is not limited in the way that our human identity as a sentient being has been limited, uh, which is primarily marked by the mental afflictions of hostility or craving or ignorance, but that we begin to identify with these great models of absolute sanity, of people like Padmasambhava, for instance, who is really central in our lineage of practice. He's the second Buddha, somebody who has achieved really the highest potential of the mind. And this is what we aspire to be. And we then in our practice absorb that identity also. So there are certain parts of the day, actually, when I work with this practice, these are what are part of the preliminaries for me, and I spend about 2 hours a day every morning doing those kinds of practices, purification practices, so that we no longer are identified with all of our failings, with all of the things that we regret, with all of our limitations. Those are really powerful identities that kind of keep us bound to who we are with this particular name. Um, and so all of our identities then, as we also pursue this process of subtraction, we can, our minds become less conceptual. And we realize that our identities are a product of conceptuality and all of our experience and feedback from other people as well. But it's a conceptuality that becomes irrelevant as we begin to spend more and more time in non-conceptuality and pure awareness.
Wow, it would be fascinating to see experiments, and I hope you have a plan to build experiments, particularly around these kinds of practices, to put on the mind of a Buddha or to put on the demeanor of a Buddha, and to see how the neurophysical mental system adjusts just from taking that new intentional, attentional stance. Jim Carrey, the actor, has talked a little bit about this as well. He's pretty amazing person, actually. And he was saying, I can put on these characters as an actor. And what would happen if I put on the character of Jesus? Or if I put on the character of Buddha? Like, would it work the same way? Because I can put myself in the mind of someone, and then I'm actually being them in some important way. So what happens? What would happen if I put on the mind of an incredibly wise being, and seeing what the sort of change would be out of the gate? So I would love to see some experiments with this. Have you done any sort of scientific third-person experiments on these sorts of practices at the center?
Not yet. So
No.
the practice. So we really have just gotten. Well, we're midway, I guess, through our first research phase or study, I guess you would say, and that is EEG study that is really looking at so 3 24-minute sessions of meditation. So the EEG is monitoring brain activity during 3 different types of meditation.
Yeah.
So one of them is a shamatha practice,
Yeah.
where the whole point is to single-pointed focus on a chosen object. Another one is open-hearted meditation of Tonglen, which is giving and taking, where you're giving away your happiness and you're accepting the suffering of other people. And so this is a real heart-opening compassion exercise of compassion. And so the EEG then is, probably finding different areas of the brain that are lighting up at that point. And then the third practice is awareness of awareness, or just open presence and just resting in non-conceptuality.
Yeah.
And so we have had 6 months of research getting data on that, and that has entered a new phase. And then of the first round of data is being analyzed now, and then part of what is really going to make, or I think is really unique about the Center for Contemplative Research, is the potential for longitudinal research here, because
we don't see this anywhere. We don't see this anywhere, these long-term studies, I mean, most of the research is done on 8-week mindfulness-based stress reduction courses where people are doing it from their home for 20 minutes a day, 12 minutes a day.
Yeah.
I was just reading a Loving Kindness. I mean, it was a good project, but it was only 8 minutes a day for 6 weeks. I mean, it's really not the same thing you're talking about at all, which is this deep expert and over a lot of time is a really rare and precious opportunity for the science of meditation.
Yeah. And I think that is the point that Daniel Goleman and Richard Davidson were making in their recent
Exactly.
book, Altered Traits,
Yeah.
and saying that exactly as you pointed out, Mark, that most research so far has been on just state changes that are temporary in undergraduates who are
Yeah.
doing had no experience in the practice, and then they, still are seeing noticeable differences even in that population. But what's really
Yeah.
needed, we believe, and this is what the point of Davidson and Goleman, uh, their point was that what we really need to see is the long-term trait changes.
Doug, I'm interested. You spoke about sort of the fact that, especially when you're young, but by no means exclusively, you can dive into the hedonism with enthusiasm. And I'm interested in what happens when uh, those who have been doing that and have been out in the world living by consumerism and hedonism start practicing on retreats, and these identities start to ebb away. Is there a process of is there a process of subtraction that you can see from the outside that affects an individual?
That you can see, so, or that a third person could see, or that a
That
person would experience themselves.
the third person science might reveal.
Yes. So, well, so that is up for the scientists, I guess, uh, to see what kind of correlates that they might see there. But there would be definitely changes in uh, blood pressure, biological markers. One of the things that was most interesting, I think, as a outcome from the Shamatha project was that there was a discovery that the enzyme telomerase, which is very critical aspect of chromosomes being able to replicate successfully, and apparently this amount of telomerase, or the telomeres at the end of a chromosome that help them replicate accurately, becomes shorter and shorter every time that it replicates, and that this is regarded as a fundamental of cellular aging until the telomeres become so short that the cell dies. And this enzyme telomerase helps to maintain the length of these telomeres. And so, for instance, that was found, and apparently that there has no known way of increasing the length of these telomeres, except what was found was that by the end of the 3 months of meditation practice, the uh, amount of telomerase increased by 30%, which is really,
Yeah.
really significant. So
This is the best
those are,
commercial. This is the best commercial to go on retreat ever, right? If
yeah,
you want to be young, if you want to stay young, meditate.
yeah. So Clifford Saron was clear in saying we aren't yet ready to claim that meditation is going to reduce aging, but this really ought to inspire more research.
Yeah. Wow. Wow. Cool.
So those are third person ways of, so biological, neurological. But I think what's also very important is that here at CCR, we recognize that it's not just third person research that's really critical, but it's first person and second person research as well. And so the first person research, people's reported changes in themselves, is going to be really, really critical in helping the third person researchers correlate that with what's actually going on inside the mind subjectively.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah, we run into that trouble all the time. You put people in a scanner or you hook them up to EEG. You tell them to give you, to let you know what's going on the inside. And if they're not trained at that, then they're really not very good at it. And we're sort of, as humans, we're systematically not very good at it unless we have sort of a deep comprehensive training. So who knows if they're attending or not attending, or if they're aware of something or not aware of something. So I can really see why bringing experts into a lab and allowing them to participate in the kind of third person science is going to be a useful way to go.
Yeah, that is what Lama Alan Wallace calls the contemplative telescope, that we are investing in our talent here, the meditators, over the long term so that they can become Olympic class introspectionists, so that the quality of their mindfulness and introspection really is at a professional level. And then that really becomes very meaningful data gathering when you're looking at your own mind from this point of stability and clarity. The quality of the data that you get will be really different.
Doug, I want to ask you a question while we have you. So I think that's pretty clear, and we've heard this story a couple of times now about the benefits that contemplatives can bring to the science of mind, in part because they're better introspectionists. But what about the other direction of fit in your experience? So contemplatives can bring a lot to the scientific exploration of the mind and maybe of the brain and wider physiology, depending on how you think those things come together. But have you had an opportunity to learn anything, or do you think the science itself, third person science, can lend anything to the contemplative? I mean, is it all going to be exhausted just by the suttas, by the ancient texts, or is there something that our science is helping us on this path, on whatever we're doing on the path, whether it's just maturing the mind and maturing emotion regulation, or really on the path of awakening? Have you, in your own experience, gotten anything out of the science that's helped your practice or your understanding of how to practice or your understanding of the states and traits of practice? I wonder.
Personally, are you asking?
Yeah, personally and sort of generally too.
Yeah. Well, I have to confess that I'm a huge fan of Ian McGilchrist, who is one of the greatest intellects, I think, with us right now, who's a fellow at All Souls College at Oxford in 3 different disciplines, and who has done, I think he's really spent his career in understanding the different ways of perceiving the world, depending on whether the right or left hemisphere is dominant in the perception.
Right.
And so that really, to me, what he's describing is a difference between the conceptual and non-conceptual mind, or a global awareness and one that is localized and very focal, but really focused on representation rather than presence, and conceptually dominated. So that has really enriched my experience of my own subjective states a great deal. So that's one thing that I have learned. And, I've learned a lot from neuroscience as well. Just some of the conclusions, Richard Davidson's conclusion that resiliency and using that as something that can be measured as neurologically, and that what he has found is that resilience in small things is an indicator of resilience in big things. So if you are shattered when you break your teacup, the chance of maintaining resiliency when you lose your mate are not as good. So practicing to develop resiliency with small losses, things like that. But
so that's sorry. I just wanted to say that's very interesting, because that seems like commonplace wisdom in the various traditions that we're interested in. But what the science does there is sort of turns the volume up on it, or makes it. I don't know. Somehow it hits the high note a little to say, yeah, you might have heard that a lot, but that's really true. Like we can verify that if you're not good with the little ones, the big ones are going to be extremely hard. And if you can get good with the little ones, you're going to be better at the big ones. So you really should take things bit by bit, day by day, minute by minute, because it really will help in the long run.
And it gives credibility to those that commonplace wisdom for a much
Right.
different audience as well.
Right.
But one of the
Right.
things that I'm interested in is